So now we're in a section of this product lab where we talk about how you can actually validate whatever product you're trying to build is actually a valid business. In other words, is your product economically viable or not? Let's start with market size and the adoption lifecycle. The market size is something that you can easily get from doing analyses. You can find out how many people exist that would in theory use your product. From there, an interesting aspect to consider is the adoption lifecycle. This is a well-researched distribution that has been shown to be true in many cases of how big different user segments are that adopt technology products in many cases or just new products in general. The idea is that when you introduce a new product, there are a few groups of people to consider. First, you have a group of people who are innovators, who are really happy and open to starting to adopt a new product and are okay with those products having flaws, acting like beta testers. The user experience may not be great at this point, but they just really want to be on the forefront of technology. And then, as you go up this curve, the audiences get bigger and bigger. The types of user also start changing. They are less and less happy with overcoming obstacles and dealing with other bad experiences. So they become less forgiving, and then at some point you reach an audience that will only adopt technologies that are well proven and already used by the majority of the market. So when you think about who you're selling a product to, it's extremely important to figure out what each one of these groups cares about, and whether each one of these groups is big enough for you to actually have a feasible business. A lot of technologies fail to go from early adopters to the early majority just because of the difference in those audiences. There's different ways of dealing with this, and I'm going to make my argument by coming back to the iPod. The most successful method that I've seen is actually to not start with this innovator and early adopter market at all. I've done some research about this topic and think that Apple is a very good example on the way that you develop products and market them directly to the early majority. See, if you tried to address innovators and early adopters, you would argue technical aspects of your products that these audiences find very compelling. So that fits into the technical description of the product. But if you're familiar with Apple products, in many cases when they launch a product, there is a community that always complains that they're not using the latest generation of connectivity standards and so on. Those are usually innovators and early adopters. However, the audience that Apple actually markets to is the early majority, and they don't care. They really just care that the product is polished and that they have very clear value propositions. And as discussed, in many cases, they care about the implicit value that these products bring because they're luxury products. So basically, Apple just jumps directly to this majority and doesn't bother with a lot of the innovators or early adopters in this space. And I think the product positioning of 1,000 songs in your pocket versus a more technically driven explanation of the product speaks to this sense. Next, when you think about whether your idea is an actual business, it's important to think about some terms that you will come across. Those are customer acquisition cost, or CAC, and average revenue per users, or ARPU. This is extremely important because businesses have different characteristics, and in many cases, this actually informs how you should run your business. For example, if you're in the low customer acquisition cost and low revenue per user space, then you're actually looking for viral growth because you can't spend much money on every user. In this space, every user just gives you a very small amount of ad revenue, like in the case of Facebook, but those users also are cheap to acquire because they grew through network effects or other organic means. The important point here is to realize that if your users have a very low average revenue over their lifetime, you can't spend a lot of money to acquire them. This is usually where a lot of startups get into trouble early, when they may spend a lot of money on customer acquisition. They may do a lot of marketing, but that's not sustainable if the expense of acquiring a new user is higher than the lifetime value of that new user. On the other end of the spectrum, you have very high lifetime value per user, and you can afford to spend a lot of money to acquire them. Workday is one of these enterprise software tool companies that big corporations use. And in this case, you can afford to have an enterprise sales team that spends a lot of time acquiring customers because once they use such a service, they pay ongoing license fees. Usually, these solutions are very sticky, meaning big corporations don't really switch their payroll software every year. Again, there's a spectrum here, but the important aspect is to really think about the correlation between customer acquisition cost and average revenue per user once you acquire them. You want to make sure that those are aligned and not spend too much money to acquire new users. If you live in a world where you spend a lot of money on acquiring new customers and you get a lot of revenue, usually you have fewer customers with higher value. In the lower acquisition cost and revenue regime, usually you have a very high number of users, but each one of them just gives you a smaller fraction of revenue. Along similar lines, it is important to consider how often your users come back to you. This is not only important to figure out both how much money you spend to actually acquire new users or how to retain them, but also thinking about your competition and basically how often your users give you a chance to make the case for your product. If someone uses the product every day, let's say the product is coffee, then essentially every day you get a chance of convincing them to use your product. In this case, there's no stickiness or very low switching cost involved. However, if you sell capital investment goods such as airplanes, usually the purchasing cycle of these products is on the order of 20 or 30 years. So the companies end up spending a lot of money and a lot of time on these contracts because once a customer has made the purchasing decision, the next opportunity to convince them of your product takes a long time to come along. Now, let's talk about market access, channel access, and defensibility. Market access is extremely important when you think about whether you have a functioning business or not. In many cases, when we think about new modern online products, we think about going directly to the consumers or users, but that's not always the case. In many cases, you have retailers in between your company and your users. In some cases, there's wholesale channels, especially if you deal with multiple retailers. And then in some other cases, you actually have agents in between you and your users. It's extremely important for you to know the distribution channels, because if you think that you can make the case to your consumers directly, and then you find yourself in a world where retailers are making the case for your product, you will have to think about very different ways of dealing with the channel and also how to communicate messages to your users. Channel access is also an extremely important aspect to take into account because specific channels have very strong barriers, such as certifications, that you have to go through before you can even sell into a channel. This is especially true in fields such as healthcare. Not everyone can sell into a specific channel. It is also true for enterprise products or business-to-business products, where some companies have ratings for suppliers. In those situations, you actually have to start creating a relationship with the company first and gain their trust, and show that you're credible and reliable before you can actually sell into a channel. Defensibility is extremely important as well. Even though you may be able to sell into a channel for a short time, the question is how sustainable is this distribution channel? In some cases, you may have a defensible distribution channel if, for example, you own the channel. This can be true in some media businesses, for example. People often assume that technology is defensible, especially if you have an innovation advantage. However, it can also be very temporary, and in many cases, companies actually underestimate their competitors and their ability to bypass them and advance technology. The talent in a team is often touted to be another defensible advantage, especially if you have assembled a unique team. However, that can also be very temporary. Timing is another advantage to think through. If your only advantage is being at the right place at the right time, that's of course only temporary, and it's only defensible if it comes with other benefits, such as network effects, where you can actually create an advantage by being the first and actually strengthening your position by growing a network of users. Another example are multi-sided platforms, where users and content providers provide value to the ecosystem. And last but not least, let's talk about long-term trends. While startups may not naturally think about 5 to 10 years time frame, this is important because you usually want to create a sustainable business and you should really spend time on thinking about long-term trends and how they affect your business. Things like changes in purchasing behaviors, changes in demographics, and large-scale economic trends can change your business. An anecdote that I like to use for this is from Mercedes, which have proven to have some good strategic thinkers in their company. Very few people actually know this, but the same company that owns Mercedes, called Daimler Chrysler, is also the company that produces smart cars. When they first produced smart cars, few people actually bought them. They had huge production capacity and not enough users. But they also realized that car ownership in big cities was on the decline. Fewer and fewer people in cities actually bought cars because there's an easier way of getting around. It's very cumbersome to own a car in a city. So they both had this overcapacity in small cars and also this big trend that would have hurt the company, and they would have sold fewer and fewer cars in most urban cities. So they decided to start a car sharing business called Car2Go, where they provide a car sharing service in the cities using the smart cars, solving both the problem of overcapacity and the revenue loss of selling fewer cars to people in cities. This is a very counterintuitive way of actually creating a long-term competitive advantage, but it's a very good example of thinking through long-term trends and how they affect your business.